and there's already a significant issue, and I think it'll obviously become more acute as fossil fuels become more scarce, and it's self-evident that we need to ensure that we have a sustainable, secure and affordable energy supply into the future. But we have to start planning for that now. We've already entered into legal obligations to move to a low carbon model. The Kyoto targets specify 20% reduction by 2020. However, that's due to be renegotiated in 2015, and we can expect that those targets will go upwards, possibly to 25 or 30%. This obviously means that we can't delay dealing with this issue. I believe that legally binding targets are absolutely essential if we're going to deliver on the targets, if we're going to achieve rather than aspire, really is what I would say. And if we continue to ignore our precarious position on energy security and climate change, we'll run the risk of creating a crisis that is every bit as grave and difficult to bear for our children and grandchildren into the future as the disgraceful postponement of this debt that was never ours in the first place. Ireland has an import dependency on fossil fuels of around 85%. The EU average is 50%. We import 93% of our natural gas, yet the perception is that we're almost self-sufficient in natural gas. We've 84 days of gasoline. If you go down to Clontarf, look across the bay, you'll see 3 huge big containers, and that is the bulk of where our 84-day supply is stored. And it just shows you how exposed we are to an oil shock. Our dependence on fossil fuels means that we have an import bill of in excess of 6 billion annually. And if that's not substituted by renewable sources, that amount is set to grow into the future, because obviously it becomes scarce and so on. We're constantly being told that one of the key strategies to deal with our current economic problems is that we grow our export economy. If we're to do that, we can't do it without an ample, affordable and sustainable energy source or range of sources. If we're to ensure the achievement of the overall goal, I believe it's essential we set ourselves, as I said before, binding targets. But you can design that in such a way that there's flexibility. If there's, for example, if there's global events or if there's a natural disaster or something, that you can move those targets, but the overall goal should remain the same. You can move them between the sectors. When we break down the Irish emissions by sector, we can see high concentrations in transport at approximately 21% and agriculture at 30%. Each of these areas on their own create more emissions than the entire industrial or commercial sectors. The other area that we need to look at is the residential sector. Looking at it from this angle, you can see the value of the sectoral approach and targets on the sectoral approach. The government published the heads of a climate change bill a couple of weeks ago. They also published a report that they commissioned from the NESC. The bill is hugely disappointing in that it doesn't contain targets. The NESC report does have some useful and very useful aspects to it, which I'll deal with later. But the problem is, it doesn't matter the good guidance that might be put together by way of documents for the department. When you match it against the delivery and the kind of policy, the policy that they're making at the moment, you can see, in fact, we're going backwards. Transport, for example, what little spending we have is predominantly spent on roads, and in fact, we're seeing rail and bus services being taken off routes, and obviously people don't have an opportunity to use public transport. Retrofit of our housing stock, there's been a near collapse in the private retrofit industry because the government has cut supports in that sector. In energy efficiency, we have a new European directive coming, yet we're nowhere near achieving the 20% target that we're required by 2020. Forestry, and we've just had a session here, is our primary carbon sink. and yet we're looking to put that resource up for sale, not to mention the control over how we will develop our forests into the future. In wind and wave, we've resisted setting up a state aid mechanism for offshore wind, and we're continually missing opportunities to enhance our marine energy research capability, the harnessing of ocean currents and tidal energy. In waste, millions have already been spent on costly incineration proposals that guarantee the people who are going to build it input, and if we don't provide enough waste, the public will have to pick up the tab. The money raised from carbon tax is not directed towards investing in renewables. It's just put into general taxation, and the environmental benefit of the car tax is all but being lost. And compared to other countries, the investment in our domestic micro-generation is really pitiful. So you can see what they might be saying some things that are right, but certainly what they're doing is against everything that should happen. The deeper obligations beyond 2020 will become even more challenging because the foreign offsets will become increasingly scarce and therefore more expensive. The EPA in April 2011 warned that the challenge of actually achieving the 20% target could not be underestimated. Each year we delay decisions and responses, the more that remains to be done within a tighter time frame. Some assumptions have also been made that are critical if we're to reach those. For example, the Food Harvest Report, they're assuming that is going to be delivered, and I don't think that there's an expectation generally that will happen. It's also essential that we keep in mind that initiatives that we might take in the short term should be taken in a way that have a cumulative effect. A good policy choice now could reduce our needs into the future. So we must change our mindset and examine the opportunities presented by renewable energy. And we have an amazing range of natural assets. You only have to look out into the Atlantic to see that. But they must be exploited. We can't remain the last country at the end of the gas pipeline, which we are at the moment. It is feasible for us to consider becoming an energy exporter. So we need to see ourselves as being the country that is first in the pipeline. The NESC report states that the Irish economy of the future will increasingly be electrified, leading to increased demand on electricity, though the increases need to be limited by much greater levels of end-use efficiency. Even with widespread electrification of energy use in Ireland, modelling work suggests that over half of our energy would be required from sources other than electricity in 2050. They go on to say wind is a cost-competitive way of providing electricity, and dramatic cost reductions for wind technologies associated with the wider deployment mean that wind could achieve parity with gas within the next 5 years. The cost of offshore wind is significantly higher than onshore wind, so it makes sense initially to meet Ireland's renewable electricity target from onshore wind, but Ireland's offshore wind resources offer a significant energy opportunity. So it's a whole new industry, if you like, that we would have a benefit from. The grid will be a key lever in the transition to a carbon neutral economy. A system dominated by variable wind energy places a particular premium on grid developments. Ireland is globally acknowledged as one of the world's prime sites for the development of renewable energy, particularly the state's wind and marine energy potential. Several studies have been undertaken in recent years into the possible economic gains to Ireland of enhancing our wind energy industry. Given that the EU accounts for 48.9% of the global wind energy production, the importance of this emerging industry to Ireland is very much apparent. The large population clusters, like, for example, the Greater London area, the Low Countries, the Rural Valley, they also recognise the potential of what the periphery can play in helping to prevent the energy crisis from becoming a catastrophe, particularly as each of these countries' governments have been committed to move away from the nuclear energy option. Hydroelectricity from Norway, wind and wave from Ireland and Scotland, Portugal and Spain producing, for example, the like of the solar option. are extremely attractive, even within a single market. High capacity power lines, smart grid development, and developing more undersea interconnections will require high levels of investment, but the rewards will be great. I just want to go back a little bit to forestry. The harvesting rights selling our harvesting rights is just an absolutely crazy idea. We need a national afforestation plan if we're to balance the variable wind energy industry. We need to consider the role that, for example, biomass will play. The NESC report says, and this is a government commissioned report, it says a real concern based on the current rate of afforestation that there will be insufficient indigenous supply of biomass material to meet demand. So forests are essential if we're going to do one thing, create carbon sink, but on the other side, create a balance to the variable wind energy. To return to the NESC report, that decisions on how land is used, they go on about the agriculture sector, and the policies that we might adopt now may well encourage farmers to plant more of the right kind of forest as well. And one area I think that there could be an awful lot of jobs created is the retrofit. Much of the housing stock that we have now will still be standing in 2050. There's a huge amount of it needs to be retrofitted, and the new builds will go to almost a zero energy standard. So it's the ones that are already built that we need to be looking at. And there's a significant opportunity in doing that, and at the same time we could be creating very large numbers of jobs. But the government are dragging their heels on even this Pay As You Save scheme that there has been a lot of talk about them introducing. And obviously there's a multiplier effect when you when you invest in the economy in terms of the amount of both short-term and long-term. We've legally binding obligations to comply with in respect of climate change. We need, as I said, a sustainable, secure and affordable energy supply with some of the greatest natural assets in the world, and we need to begin delivering a return on those assets. Otherwise, the legacy of this generation will leave our children and our grandchildren not just a huge debt, but a huge problem in relation to having to do much more within much tighter time frames, and that's unacceptable. Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is Paul Murphy, who's an MEP from the Socialist Party, MEP for Dublin.
Thanks a lot. Oh no, but you can tell me as well. Okay, at the end of last summer in September, the ice cap in the Arctic Ocean fell to the lowest level that it's ever been recorded. It was only covering 24% of the ocean, compared to the most recent worst before that was 2007, when it was covering 29% of the ocean. And that single fact is extremely significant for a whole bunch of reasons. Firstly, it illustrates how the process of global warming as a result of human actions is happening fast, how it's happening faster than was originally predicted, and how the feedback effects of a process that's ongoing means that the old models about how fast this process will happen are being discarded by actual reality. Like, now they're suggesting that we could reach a summer with no ice in the Arctic Ocean by 2020, 7 years time, when the International Panel on Climate Change, when they originally did their report, they said that was something that was perhaps at the end of this century was something that could happen, but that the whole process is happening much faster than indicated. Secondly, this is part of the reason why it's underestimated, but it's significant in and of itself, is that the disappearance of the Arctic ice cap has a significant implication in terms of another speeding up of the process of global warming, because the existence of ice reflects the sun back off of the planet, whereas when it melts, becomes water, it absorbs more and more heat, and so the process is speeded up. And so in and of itself, the fact that you have less ice means that the process of global warming is quickened. Another extremely significant and extremely dangerous consequence is that the melting of the Arctic ice caps not only will see the loss of life of polar bears and other species, but potentially could see the melting of the ice sheet, which sits on top of Greenland. The Arctic ice melting by itself doesn't actually increase the sea level, but if the ice sheet on Greenland was to be melted and to go into the water, or a significant portion of it, the result would be catastrophic in terms of the levels of increase of sea levels, the level of increase of the sea level around the world. If all of the Greenland ice sheet was to melt and to go into the water, the increase in world sea levels would be 7.5 meters. London, Los Angeles would be underwater, together with all of those places that will be underwater with minimal change. Bangladesh, the Maldives, obviously primarily it's the poor people who will pay the price for this. So it's an extremely significant development, and it's happening very, very fast. It's part of feeding into the more extreme weather conditions we have every year. You can't, say that this particular weather event was caused by global warming, or that particular weather event was caused by global warming. But we do know that global warming increases the chance of extreme weather events. And in the last whole number of years, you've had tens of thousands of people die on a yearly basis, again, primarily the poor, as a result of those extreme weather events. It's estimated that 300,000 people die each year because of problems related to climate change: drought, famine, flooding, and all of these things are real consequences for real people around the world. It's estimated that by 2050, we'll have 200 million refugees as a result of climate change. So you have this really significant event in terms of the Arctic ice. And what was the response of the world's establishment? Did they quickly put their heads together and say, okay, this has gone far enough, we need to, there's a paper in Nature recently that said, in order to avoid the Arctic ice reaching a tipping point of no return, you need to have reductions in greenhouse gas emissions of 60% over the next number of years, and then to bring it down continually below that. That's what's necessary. So what was the response of the establishment? The political establishment, the economic establishment. And the main response to the melting of the Arctic ice was to open up a new race to the North Pole. Shell has started drilling, or was sending drilling ships north of Alaska. ExxonMobil has done a deal with Rosneft in Russia. Russia, Canada, the US, they're all engaged in, at the moment, diplomatic maneuvers, but also building up military power in the Arctic region, because they're interested in two things in the Arctic. One, they're interested in shipping lanes. It'll open up much faster shipping access for world's trade, and whoever controls that has significant political but also economic power. But secondly, and ironically, it'll open up a whole lot more fossil fuels. They want to get oil and gas. And so there'll be another feedback effect of the melting of the ice, which is that the ice is going to melt because these people have destroyed our planet. They're going to take out more oil and gas, and they're going to burn it, and they're going to speed up the process of global warming as a result of doing that. And instead of doing anything positive, that's what they're actually doing. And then at the same time, they're engaged in the Doha Agreement. Doha Agreement is an agreement to do basically nothing except to continue to talk, to pretend that they're doing something, to suggest that they're doing something. They effectively agreed two things at Doha. One, to set up a compensation fund to compensate those countries that are impacted mostly by the impact of global warming, of climate change. But they didn't agree to put any money in the compensation fund, and they didn't agree a date by which the compensation fund would exist. And they've already made promises in the past. They're meant to be giving, developed countries are meant to give $100 billion a year to tackle climate change. They only give $10 billion a year, so it's an empty promise. And then the other agreement made at Doha was to extend Kyoto until 2020. It's an agreement in and of itself. It's entirely inadequate compared to the scale of the problem and the crisis facing the planet. But also, it only covers 15% of the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions in terms of the countries that are covered by the deal. Within the EU, the EU, of all the imperialist powers and imperialist blocs, the EU poses as the most environmentally friendly because it's under more pressure from below. It's part of its image. But the way it tries to do it is this cap and trade carbon trading system. And it's a complete failure. The price for carbon now is €7 per tonne, which is just nothing. It means that the whole scheme is a total failure because they've given out so many free permits to so many different companies that it simply means nothing. And it's an illustration of the failure of so-called market-based solutions based on allowing people to pollute and then trade that right, sell that right to pollute with others. And then the other conclusion is that there will be no new UN treaty until 2020. They'll begin the process in 2020. And so they're saying it's fine. Whereas what climate change scientists are saying is that by 2020, if we want to avoid having an increase in the world's temperature by 2 degrees, which is like a crucial tipping point, after that it gets more and more dangerous, and we're likely to be heading towards 2 degrees fairly quickly in terms of the carbon emissions that are already out there. But scientists say that you need to achieve a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2020, and they've just agreed not to do anything about it until after 2020, when they'll return to talk about it. Literally, the world's establishments are fiddling while our planet is heating up, and the result is devastation for our planet and for people who have to live on the planet, in particular, the people in lesser developed countries. My fundamental point I would make is that this system, a capitalist system based on production for profit, is not capable of dealing with climate change. Maybe if climate change was a process that happened in one country, you could have a capitalist class and establishment in that one country deciding, okay, in our long-term interests, we're going to take a hit on our GDP, we're going to invest because they recognize their own interests. But climate change is an international phenomenon. Capitalism is an international system. And because of the nature of that system, no one section of capitalism wants to pay the price that is necessary to be paid, not necessarily at the expense of ordinary people's living standards, but none of them are willing to do it. The US doesn't want to pay. The US is the biggest polluter per capita, 20% of the world's greenhouse emissions with 5% of the world's population. US oil and gas companies, US business generally isn't willing to pay that price. And the same with the other major imperialist powers around the world. And for me, there is no stronger argument for fundamental system change, for revolutionary transformation from below than climate change and what's happening around the world and what it threatens, humanity and the planet. And that what is needed clearly is planning on a world basis, planning to shift from fossil fuel-based economies to renewable-based economies, but not just that, planning to reduce consumption of energy, planning to produce housing, produce manufactured goods in a far more efficient, energy-efficient manner, planning in particular to significantly reduce individual car usage, to have massive expansions of public transport, together with electric cars, hydrogen cars, etc., etc. We know basically what we need to do, which includes research and development into a whole number of areas. But the system as it currently exists, in my opinion, is completely incapable of stepping up to the mark, of dealing with that crisis. Just finally, to take the case of Ireland, Ireland has, like Catherine was saying, has huge renewable energy resources, wind and wave, the biggest per capita in all of Europe, because Ireland is an island in the Atlantic, and so we're surrounded by wind, we're surrounded by waves. It has the potential, definitely, unlike most countries in Europe, to be a net exporter of wind and wave energy. Britain probably could be as well because of its position. But that's the potential. That potential has been left to the private sector because that's the neoliberal model, that's what's meant to happen. And the result is that we have relatively little. Yes, a section of the private sector is now beginning to get interested, and that's the model that the government is going to go on. But we have relatively little in terms of wind and wave energy production, and in particular, we have nothing in terms of an indigenous industry, in order to make it viable. So the government is committed to incentivising the private sector. There are now private companies interested in getting licenses, in getting strategic planning permission, and interested in doing it. But I have to say that even though you can have a certain development of wind and wave energy on the basis of the private sector in Ireland, it'll be inadequate. It won't be planned, obviously, because you have different companies doing their own thing in different areas. It'll be insufficient, and also it'll be done in a way that will cause other problems. If you build a whole load of onshore wind turbines, well, then that does create a problem for people. That isn't necessarily the solution. Offshore is obviously more expensive, so they're less likely to go for it at a first stage. In my opinion, and I'll leave it at this, I think it points to, they use the argument about oil and gas, and we reject it, but they use the argument that, you need the private sector because there's massive risks. You have a lot of investigation to do, exploratory drilling, etc., etc. It's huge investment. There's no way the state could possibly take on that risk. We know the wind is there. We know the waves are there. There's no question about any of that. And that argument doesn't hold in this case. And what the strong argument is for massive public investment under a revamped and democratized ESB, like ESB developed electricity production in this country in the first place. In the ULA budget statement, we put forward a figure of 20 billion euros investment over 5 years to develop a sustainable industry that would create tens of thousands of jobs and would allow massive production of wind and wave energy in terms of quickly going to a position whereby 40%, 60% of our energy is produced renewably, together with all the other things that need to be done to tackle climate change. Thanks.
Okay, our last speaker is Molly Walsh from Friends of the Earth. Do you want to give her?
I've got one about it.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk briefly a little bit about the global nature of the problem and then bring it home to the Irish nature of the problem and talk a little bit about solutions or ways around it. So as Paul talked there about the ice melting and the ice cap melting, and a lot of scientists have called Arctic ice the canary in the coal mine. It's the signal that something is very wrong. It doesn't actually result in our human lives being lost, but it's an important signal that something is very wrong and that we need to do something. It is happening faster than is being thought. And there's a lot of other impacts that are currently impacting on human lives. I think there's a figure of 300,000 that's estimated by the UN. People die every year as a result of climate change. So climate change for us might be something that's a little bit distant, that impacts are going to hurt us more in the future. But for thousands of people living mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, it's impacting them right now. If rain patterns are disrupted, you can't rely on the crops that you used to rely on. And in Friends of the Earth, we work very closely with development agencies like Trócaire and Oxfam. And sometimes people are surprised that they're putting so much time and energy into climate change. But they say that the people that they work with in the developing world, the people who are very vulnerable, climate change is just making their lives worse and much more precarious every day. That brings me a little bit onto the what's a safe level of climate change. And we've heard the 2-degree figure mentioned so far. 2 degrees isn't actually a figure decided by scientists. There were a few scenarios in an IPCC report. There was a 2-degree, a 4-degree, and a 6-degree scenario. And the EU looked at those three scenarios and thought, well, under 2 degrees there aren't particularly bad impacts in Europe, so that's what we're going to call a safe level of climate change. Let me be clear, 2 degrees is an impacted climate change world. It will result in more deaths. It will definitely result in some impacts in Europe, flooding, droughts, and also climate change refugees or environmentally displaced people who have to travel from countries where it's less viable to live. And I think that's going to be a very difficult moral question for us in the future. If people have had to leave their homes as a result of a problem that we caused and they didn't cause, are we going to say, you're not welcome here, there's no space for you? So that's where the 2 degrees comes from. And talking a little bit but earlier today, listening to people talking about fossil fuels, the question of fossil fuel resources, and that's often what we mean when we say natural resources, and climate change are inextricably linked. The estimate is that we can, to have a 50% chance of staying within 2 degrees, that's a 50-50 chance of staying within the level that the EU has decided is safe. We can only burn a third of what the oil and gas companies have on their books. So that's a third of what's already been discovered and declared, not even things that haven't yet been discovered, where we try to suck the last dredges of the oil and gas from the planet. So can you imagine a profit-making company deciding that they're only going to exploit a third of the asset that they have? It's very difficult to imagine. There's also an urgency involved here. John Sweeney just the other day said on Drive Time that we have 8 years to peak our emissions and start serious reductions. 8 years is very, very soon. If you realise that the spire on O'Connell Street is already 10 years old, and remember that it was 10 years ago that we were all trying to decide if we liked it or not. So within that time frame again, we have to be on a serious path to reductions. One of the reasons that it's so urgent is those feedback loops that we were hearing. If the ice melts, the albedo effect will result in, that's the fact that if the ice melts, then dark water is revealed. And if you know, if you ever touched a hot car, dark surfaces absorb heat a lot faster, whereas white surfaces reflect them to some extent. So the darker water will heat the planet faster. And also there's those, I've never heard them called feedback effects before, but those human behavioural feedback effects of because we just have destroyed the planet, we can now get more oil and gas to destroy the planet faster. So if we don't do something very serious within 8 years' time, we're facing really harsh impacts of climate change the world over. And yeah, so are we doing anything about it? That's the next question I'm going to address a little bit. Catherine mentioned the heads of the climate change bill that was published a couple of weeks ago by the Irish government. I've been campaigning for years for climate change legislation, so have Friends of the Earth. And it was only about 3 months ago that we started demanding that there be targets in legislation, because before we took it as a foregone conclusion. Like, let me be very clear about government policy. If you don't set a target for it, it's paramount to saying you don't want to do it. When we want to reduce road deaths, what do? We set targets. When we want to reduce homelessness, what do? We set targets. Every time when we want to increase jobs, what do? We set targets. If a government won't set targets for something, they don't want to do it. Let me be clear, the Irish government has no intention of reducing climate change emissions. And here's why. A lot of our emissions come from, as John Gormley used to say, cows and cars. In everyone's desperate struggle to restart growth, we're putting a lot of faith in the agri-food sector. As an environmental lobbyist, my biggest enemy isn't business, like a lot of my colleagues is around the world, although be clear, IBEC have no interest in reducing emissions either. It's the IFA. Everywhere I go, there are 2 IFA lobbyists, and they happily stand up. And I've heard somebody stand at the top of the conference and say with pride, do you know that 10% of the baby milk in the world is made in Ireland? 1 in 10 babies the world over drinking baby milk are drinking Irish milk. Isn't that wonderful? So we are exporting our meat and dairy products, increasing our emissions, and attempting to restart our economy and build our green boom on that basis. And interestingly, it involves a lot of greenwash. Board BIA have a campaign called Origin Green, and there's a famous Irish celebrity, I can't remember her name now, it escapes me. Saoirse Ronan, that's it. And they have a short YouTube clip where she wanders through Irish fields, sort of like looking a little bit like she's on drugs, and saying, our fields have always been this green, our water is always this teeming with fish. So Ireland is a green island, and we're going to intensify our agriculture. And the IFA is very, very close to Irish government. They're very close to Fine Gael and they're very close to Fianna Fáil. And if it was just a straight fight between myself and the business lobby, between between the environmental lobby and the business lobby, I'd be much more up for it. It'd be difficult, it'd be hard, that's for sure. But it might be a lot easier. But most politicians, to notable exceptions, sharing the panel with me, when a farming lobbyist says jump, they definitely say how high. It's very difficult in Irish politics to say that you're not a farmer. A lot of Irish politicians will start any speech by saying, I'm a farmer, I'm from a farming background. And they set up this very false kind of urban versus rural, which has a kind of very unpleasantness underlying it, which I think is about class. It's about the idea that if you don't live in a big house with lots of green surroundings, there's something sort of dirty about you or not quite right. And that, the working classes live in the city and work in factories, and we're a rural country. So that closeness of IVEC and the IFA primarily to power, to political power in Ireland, has meant that setting meaningful greenhouse gas reductions targets, or actually any sort of meaningful plan in any way to tackle climate change, isn't something that I see Ireland doing very seriously in the near future, unless we change something. So my analysis is certainly that a big part of the problem is pollution. So some of those things would be boring things like decent climate change legislation, which is something that Catherine has proposed. Climate change legislation like that they actually have in the UK and in Austria, where you set a target and then politically the politicians have to argue over what that target is. I don't like the analogy, but in the recent wage talks, I heard somebody representing one of the unions say on the radio, I don't like the target, but that's the target and we have to argue within that. Good climate change legislation sets up a kind of interlocking architecture of targets, parliamentary accountability and independent advice. So if government is off target, an independent agency, a bit like the Road Safety Agency, publishes a report that says you're off here, you're off there, you need to do something about our agricultural emissions, that kind of thing. It allows public pressure and opposition pressure to in some ways keep a government on track. Since this government, there's only been one actual debate about climate change in the Dáil, and that was when Catherine's bill got to second stage. Up until then, TDs had never had to say a word about climate change. They got away with it completely. And the minister had never had to stand to account on climate change. And a piece of climate change legislation sets up those yearly annual points for questioning and consideration in a sensible democratic way of how we're going to meet this challenge. And another thing is energy and renewable energy. And I think the impetus to move away from fossil fuels is as an opportunity in a lot of ways. And one of that is about ownership. It is, I share the rejection of the idea that we need private businesses to extract oil and gas for us. But if you actually look at it, harnessing renewable energies is a lot easier. To build an oil rig, you do need a certain level of expertise that I don't expect most people can get to. You can get a lot of autonomy from running a windmill yourself, and it's not that difficult to learn. Like, I don't consider myself technical, but I've got quite close to learning how to build a windmill. And also community ownership of those resources as well. And this is an area that environmental NGOs are looking at campaigning on across Europe now. There's this kind of NIMBY idea that people don't like windmills, but if you do really interesting surveys, if people are profiting from those windmills, as in that money is going into their community themselves, their feelings about them change a lot. So something being imposed on your landscape by a private company that wants to make money, we have a natural disinclination to that. But if it's owned by your community, you decide which hill to put it on yourselves, that's a lot nicer. So decent parliamentary accountability and community ownership of renewable energy is part of the solution that I see as I said, while we wait for the revolution. Thank you.
The question. One of the things that was mentioned there was about how private are taking over. We need private expertise. But isn't it, or could there be some way that we can have private expertise with public control, that the government take control, but we still have the private people coming in, and you have the individuals with the expertise coming in, but it's still under control of state or national or wherever they are, as we said in the last one. And the other thing I was just going to mention, I know Global comes into it an awful lot, but on the Irish end of it, I was just making a comment about some place in Austria, maybe Molly might remember. Some little village in Austria, I saw a video about it on YouTube a couple of weeks ago, where the village was complaining that their children and everything was leaving and there was no people left except the old and children, babies. And they set up on renewable energy. I think they used the forest as well as biomass and other stuff. And they have now built up a complete energy efficient village where everything, they heat 80 to 90% of the village, and all the electricity is promoted all in one area. So that we could get the bigger towns to have their own local energies under government or national. Anything extra goes into the national grid. Sorry, could you hear everything I said? Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much.
Paul, Martin Gallagher. Paul, the race to gain control of the shipping lanes and the oil and gas resources. I worked for Netlights 4 years ago in Australia, a huge shipping company. And there's a sack-fast and a pack-fast shipping line in the southern hemisphere. Where does Ireland stand in this shipping lane business on our west and our east coast in relation to the previous discussions we've had in the past in relation to control of our natural resources, transport and that sort of business? Because all the shipping will not be going up the eastern coast of the States. There will be quite a lot of shipping going up the west coast of Africa, alongside the west coast of Europe. It will be coming across through the Channel as well. It will affect the whole of Scotland, England and Wales, and it will affect the whole island of Ireland on the east and the west coast. So, with the likes of Cora Rep, you might be familiar with them in the EU, the Council of Permanent Representation. What is the EU stance on our shipping lanes, based on the fact that the gentleman from Norway, I think, said earlier on, referencing that for 25% control of water, we're only getting 4% yield of fish. Is there any possibility that the panel could explore as to what is any government stance on our future shipping lane rights?
Anyway, I'd just like to take up some technical opportunistic argument we always meet when we talk about how to change the economy. Because, for example, in Norway, when we're discussing the production of oil and gas, the argument for the government is that we have to keep on producing both oil and gas because our oil and gas is taking about a much cleaner way than the others. And strangely enough, in Canada, when they discuss whether or not we should take up the tar sands, they are saying that from the consumption of tar sands. And in a sense, it's right. The essence that we have to cope with those arguments and be very clear about it, how to cope with it. For example, when it comes to the discussion of gas, which is presented as very clean, the point is that we can't produce more gas than we do today. If we replace gas, as I said earlier, for oil and coal, it doesn't matter. It doesn't solve the problem. So if you in Ireland, for example, end up producing gas, you have to say that, okay, only when it's connected to a program where you have to change the economy. Because if it's not, it's just pouring more carbon into the economy. And that's the case for all of these areas. So the essence has to be clear that we want to when we struggle, we have to struggle against all these kind of arguments. Even the fracking. In the US now they're using the fracking as that's the reason we know are going down on the level of CO2 produced in the USA. But the point is that by increasing the fracking, you are locking yourself into a new kind of economy where you have to produce gas. Neither coal, neither oil, neither coal is the answer. The answer is one thing. That's a renewable energy, and it has to start fast. And that's have to be our main argument all the time.
It's me? Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Oh, whatever was it?
It's fine.
Okay. Thanks. And just to say, I completely agree with the last speaker that we do have to, because there are so many different arguments around our natural resources at the moment and about how they are produced and who's benefiting and who's gaining. But there is that fundamental. We have to start having that discussion at some point as well. That when are we going to stop? When are we going to stop pulling out these resources unless we're going in a different direction altogether and investing it in how we produce renewable energy? So it brings up what June was mentioning earlier on about the wind farms, and I think it's something we're not talking about. We haven't had a session in particular on today, but it is something very interesting. This move around the Midlands for wind farms, for farmers to have an individual huge windmill on their farm, but the people of Ireland again will not benefit from it. I wanted to just ask maybe Paul and Catherine will comment on this, because certainly in the Keep Dublin Bay Oil Rig Free campaign, we spent a lot of time looking at the EU regulations on the environment and different ones that were being quoted at us all the time. We had to look into them and see what they said. But basically, it struck me that things like the Argus Convention, which the government signed up to in Phil Hogan in June 2011, shortly after taking office, said signed up to the Argus Convention about how which has at its core the idea that environmental decisions are best made with the participation, the best participation possible of the public. Now, it seems like we just write utter roughshod over every single one of the EU regulations in this area, that there are endless ones that there is no respect for, and maybe just to comment on that, or where that can fit in any way, or how to the situation here. But one thing I think we need to point to, because I don't think that is working for us, is Council Point in Ireland. I was very young when my parents dragged me off to Council Point to protest against nuclear power. And it was an amazing experience. It was great fun as a small child when we had thousands of people sitting around, and I didn't really know what it was all about at the time. But there were huge protests in Council Point back in the mid-1970s, and nuclear power was stopped in Ireland. And it's something that we don't talk about enough, that there was a big plan. Desi O'Malley wanted to bring nuclear power to Ireland, and by thousands of people taking to Council Point for the weekend, it was dropped. Very quietly, it just dropped. There wasn't a big fanfare about it being dropped. It was just dropped as an issue. And Ireland has remained nuclear power free. I don't think that's not necessarily that it won't come up again in Ireland, because I think with climate change, some people are starting to point to nuclear power as a clean way of developing energy, and maybe people can comment on that as well. But I think that is a very good example that in any movement for change, we should point to a little bit more often. It was incredibly successful and not talked about half enough. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, just to say, I have a few people here, and
I want to start by absolutely agreeing with the speakers about the urgency of the situation. And last year, 2012, really showed that climate change is not something for the future, but that it's happening now. Actually, you don't have to look just to the undeveloped world. You look at what happened to the American climate last year, where they had the hottest summit that they've had since records began, where they had 40 states had drought experiences and so on, etc. It's very, very urgent. I also agree strongly with Paul's point, Paul Murphy's point, that I think that it is virtually impossible for capitalism, international capitalism, to deal with this problem, because capitalism is based on production for profit and it's based on competition, and those two things mean that they are just not going to hold the competitive race, and the competitive race is dominated by giant multinational corporations like Exxon, the biggest corporation in the world, Royal Dutch Shell, BP, and so on. They're not going to do it. Now, this creates a problem for us all. It creates a political problem, because as Slavoj Žižek said, many people find it easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. The moment you start talking about the end of capitalism, people go, oh, well, you can't do that. It's impossible. We all know it's destined forever, etc., etc. Well, I'm sorry, but we're going to have to confront this. We're going to have to get used to it. However difficult it seems, because year on year, we're going to head towards more and more catastrophes. Climate change is not something that says the world ends. The world will be fine. The world doesn't end in 100 years' time or 50 years' time, maybe. Climate change means that millions upon millions of people die and suffer, and with increasing intensity year on year. And we will get worse and worse catastrophes. And I agree with Molly's point. We need to face up this about what it means, among other things, is huge numbers of refugees. Now, the question of refugees poses a moral problem because it's a political problem. You look at the world today and there will be no shortage of people, from Golden Dawn in Greece to Marine Le Pen to the British National Party to Jobbik in Hungary, whose response to that will be a fascist response. There needs to be a socialist response to the question of refugees, which says, yes, refugees are welcome here, but as part of a fight for the interests of ordinary people. The last point I want to say is just this. There is a force in the world more powerful, potentially, than the power of ExxonMobil, Royal Dutch Shell, BP, and the rest of the multinational corporations. That is the people, the working people, who make all the wealth in the world. They potentially, and there are now hundreds and thousands of millions of such people. There are hundreds of millions of them in China or India or whatever. And we need to relate the struggle for the environment to the interests of those working people. And we can, I believe, in that way, challenge capitalism.
And one of my major concerns is that what do we do about this situation? Apart from studying international business, I've analyzed so much data about this, collected so much information. But data is useless without insightful analysis. Data is useless without meaningful interpretation. Data is useless without decisive actions. We need to do something and we need to do it now. And I graduated myself with a first class in international business, and I was thinking to myself, do you go for a multinational job and let them suck up all your talent and make profit as usual? And I said, no. I want to change myself. I want to be this change I want to see. And I realized that the world has enough resources for everybody's need, not everybody's greed. These multinational companies, their main motive is profit. All this thing you have about corporate social responsibility is nothing. They are not doing anything about it. 25,000 people die every day. That's 9,125,000 people every year from poverty. What do we do about this? We need to take decisive action. And as you see, climate change, it's global. It's global. It's happening in Nigeria, it's happening in Kenya, and I've seen people taking actions. I'll cite an example. There's a company called Solar Systems. It's now in Kenya, Uganda, and it's teaching women how to become entrepreneurs and use renewable energy like solar lanterns.
And I think we should be paying these taxes unless they're going on the right things, but that should be an issue we should fight on as well.
The other thing is, and it's something my father said to me years and years ago, I never understood it, but he always told me Ireland was a great country. Our winters aren't too cold, our summers aren't too hot. He said, we better prepare this country for mass immigration. Now I understand his point. Because these countries that are heating up in the summer are getting too cold in the winter. People have to leave. If they're fleeing for their lives, it's life or death. And we cannot close our door to these people. So that's another concern with this whole issue. We have to prepare for this. To me, the haven't talked about again about the wind power. We just had kind of like it's conflicting where we know people have issue with the windmills and we don't want to be having these windmills plotted all over our landscape, ruining it, and then we're exporting the energy somewhere else. So that's always going to be an issue. I think maybe we should be looking at putting solar panels on every house, end of story, and bringing every house up to date with a solar panel that sustains itself, and all new planning laws should have that in. As far as with the ozone, we're covered. We know it's gone. The only thing they're protecting us at the moment is pollution. And to me, it's more like the issue of the global dimming, just as it is on the global warming. So that needs to be, I think, if someone can explain that to me, I'd love to hear more on that. But the other thing, what I think we've done too, which is a big issue, and we're not looking at it, is we're flying more airplanes than we ever have since the 70s. And the airplanes are probably causing more damage than my little car on the road. And I'm not going to save the ozone by running my car. But the other thing is, do we have to wait for a revolution to change? I think it's mindset that has to change. And if we're waiting for a revolution, 8 years is too late. We're already 20 years into this. And something should have been done about it long ago. Let's not wait for a revolution. Let's start pushing the change now. We need it now.
Sorry, can I just say, there's two people who've indicated that they wanted to speak.
Okay, look, loads of questions. On shipping lanes, I don't have a clue, but I can find out and I'll chat to you afterwards and definitely do that. And in terms of the specifics of EU regulations and stuff, again, I can find out. We can talk about it. I mean, in general, the regulations are something that can be used. You know, they exist, they're law. The Aarhus Convention is something that can be used, but often it's one of these things that's a bit more nebulous, like the Charter of Fundamental Rights or whatever, something that's like grand, the EU or whatever is covering themselves with good words about the environment and stuff, but doesn't mean that it's actually like actionable by people. I think just in terms of some other specifics, the question raised at the back about can we use private expertise in the context of public investment, public ownership, etc. Yeah, I think we can. I mean, it depends on what you mean by private expertise, but the people who know about these things are people. They're ordinary workers, they might be skilled workers, they might be technicians, they might have university degrees and doctorates and whatever, but they're ordinary workers. And absolutely, I mean, there's no actual barrier to massive public investment, including democratic public ownership, involving utilising the skills and talents of these people as part of directing investment to where it's needed. And then the other question that was raised, which I think is a good point, about local production of energy, because if you're just talking kind of shorthand about renewable energy, you can give the impression that, okay, all we need to do is like build loads and loads of wind turbines off the west coast of Ireland and they'll just make so much energy that's grand, we'll just be able to export it. It's not as simple as that. The wind doesn't blow all the time, and then you're left with problems when the wind isn't blowing. You need to have reserve power. It's expensive to transport energy. You lose a lot of energy in the process of transporting energy. There's a whole number of things, and like a solution in terms of a renewable-based economy isn't just, it's not about taking our existing model of energy production and replacing major fossil fuel-based production with renewable-based production. It's partly about that, but also I think it is, I mean, something George Monbiot argues for, something he calls like the energy internet, whereby you have local-based energy production on people's homes, solar power, wind power, that can be feed into a national grid or feed into their own homes or whatever as part of, you know, a different system of organising how we produce energy, but also then how we consume energy. And that's the point about airplanes. We do need to there is an issue with large-scale usage of airplanes. It is extremely problematic because of the nature of it. It's something that's rising extremely fast. Obviously, I am very guilty of using many airplanes. I use 2 airplanes a week. My fossil fuel impact my footprint is absolutely massive. There is a need, which can be done, through extensive use of trains, buses, etc., where possible, to move away from airplanes, because it's probably, we're a very long way away from like hydrogen-fueled airplanes or electric-fueled planes. We just can't do that, and so that is a real problem that isn't just resolved by this other things. Just in terms of 2 then general points, it's interesting. It's like kind of a certain debate, reform or revolution, takes place again in the context of environmental change. And I agree with what Molly said, that we can't wait for revolution. We need to fight for all the best reforms we can, the best legislation we can now. But I think we have to do it. And I don't think Molly disagrees with me. Within the context of a broader struggle for societal change. One thing that the Greens did before the last election, they said climate change is just so serious. It's just too important. Things are happening too fast that we can't afford not to be in power. We can't afford to allow Fianna Fáil to be in power by itself and to do nothing about the environment. So then the Greens got into power and they did nothing about the environment, and they imposed cuts on people, and they destroyed themselves as a political party. And so the logic that things are so urgent, we have to do something quickly, results, if you just accommodate to the system, in doing nothing. The way to get reforms now is to build a massive movement from below, and it is the point about, it needs to be integrated into the struggles of people around the questions of austerity, around the questions of people having control over their own lives, control over the economy. And it's such a real thing for people now. I mean, I remember when we started discussing climate change, it was something, or environment generally, it was something quite distant for people. Whereas I do think it's real for people now. It is possible to mobilise people increasingly on these issues. You have huge protests in Australia around the questions of climate change because it's something very, very real that affects people's lives. And I think that's the fundamental question. The only way we'll get anything in terms of reforms or whatever is through a massive movement from below. But the problem is of such a type that a system based on production for profit and a division of the world into various imperialist powers who then have externalities of destroying the rest of the world is not capable of dealing with that problem. And that's why the fundamental perspective in terms of socialist change and democratic planning, I think, is necessary.
I'll just address a few kind of more localised issues. The issue of carbon tax. Are we going to change culture if we take tax and call it carbon tax and it's not carbon tax, it's general tax? It's just a label to put on it. That whole idea of that carbon tax was that the money would go into things like retrofitting people's homes so as that their utility bills were lower. There was a return on that carbon tax. If it's not put into that, you don't get the return. And quite rightly, people will feel will want to resist it. If it's used for what it's intended for, they get a benefit out of it. So, it's nonsense even to call it carbon tax. I think in relation to wind power and onshore wind power, I mean, the Irish Convention has to be honestly delivered. I mean, what's happening in the Midlands is that people are finding out by accident that maybe a neighbour has signed up. It has to be done in a way where there is a community return on it, and as Molly said, that delivers a different response from the community because there's a community benefit. I completely agree with the point in relation to the agriculture industry, and I believe that that's why we don't have targets in this bill that the government have produced. It's completely about the agriculture industry, and I always feel when the IFA contact me that they summon me. They don't contact me, they expect me to be there, and we were dominated by the construction sector, more or less, it was another arm of government, where we are most definitely seeing the agriculture sector as another arm of government. And indeed, some of the challenges that we face because of decisions we've made in the past, like the very dispersed pattern of settlement that we've had in the country, present us with a huge challenge in relation to how we're going to deal with transport. in a sustainable way, because people just don't live within walking distance, or they don't have public transport, and it's not sustainable economically to deliver public transport, onto every mountaintop. So there are things that are going to be particular challenges for us. But the one thing that we don't have here is we don't have political commitment, and that is our biggest challenge. The very absence of targets indicate that. But one thing, when I put my own bill forward, I was lucky enough to come out in the lottery and have it debated there a few weeks ago. One of the things that was really useful was the number of people who said to me in the Dáil, loads of people from my constituency contacted me and asked me to support your bill. So don't think that people power doesn't matter. Don't think that even that kind of intervention doesn't matter, because I tell you something, it is noticed. And if somebody puts their name and address on the email, it is noticed doubly if it's in the constituency of the person who has been asked to do it. So these simple things, whether it's a phone call, whether it's an email, whether it's a placard or a protest, whatever, all of those things matter. But I just want to finish up by agreeing with the contributor from Nigeria, who was talking about having all of the data, but it does need the analysis. But the thing that it really needs is it needs the determination and the ability to deliver, to actually make the difference. There's no point in doing all the analysis and putting it on the shelf. We have got to see a delivery on this, and we've got to see it in double quick time. As Molly has said, we've 8 years to really deliver, and now is the time that we need to start doing that. Not in a year's time. We're navel gazing with the particular climate change bill that we have at the moment. We've got the heads of the bill. The committee I'm on is going to be debating it over months. And then it'll go back to the minister, and then the minister will produce an inadequate bill, and essentially, that isn't good enough. We need to start hassling the government, getting onto them now and saying that we need to do our bit. And the first thing that we need is a decent climate change bill that does have the things in it that can produce the things that will deliver the results, because it has to have a mechanism to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not going to respond to any really specific questions, but I thought that there was a couple of themes that really ran through most of the questions, and that was the themes of energy and our ownership and control over those energies, and who uses them and how we use them. And it goes back a little bit to that thing about us not being able to burn all the fossil fuels that there are. And I think that question about if we have expertise, do we need expertise, and totally Paul's point about people have those expertise, like no corporation anywhere actually owns expertise, it's in people's heads. And certainly we could see a scenario where we have a state-run oil and gas company, and that would have those expertise and employ those people. That's perfectly fine. But one of the points that I was making was that there's actually not required so much expertise for community ownership of renewable energy, because renewable energy is slightly less complex, and that is one of our great opportunities here. I totally agree with what Catherine was saying about the IFA and the farming lobby sort of becoming the new construction lobby, the new most powerful lobby. But the really ironic thing is that the IFA lobbying tactics and policies don't benefit the small farmers they claim to represent. And it really baffles me sometimes. I feel like going up to them and saying, you're not doing yourself out of a job. Like, if you really prevent any climate action that's going to seriously disadvantage the members that you represent. I don't understand it. Like, the IFA don't work for the small farmers, they work for the and then to say a little bit about renewable energies and to go back to Paul ended on the point of democratized decision making and a smart grid, which is a bit like what Monbiot talked about the energy internet. Wind doesn't always blow somewhere in Ireland, but it always blows somewhere in Europe. So if we have really good solar energy coming in from Spain, interestingly, talking about targets, Ireland have set targets for our renewable energy resources, We've got a target of 40% renewables coming into our grid by 2020, and that's above our EU target. And we're almost there, actually. Our last figures show we're at 19%. So the average amount of renewable energy coming into the Irish grid is almost 20%, which is really quite high compared to EU. Like, we have got a lot of renewable resources, mostly in wind. But, you know, Spain has a lot of solar energy. In Ireland we have a lot of wind, and in Norway they have wind and wave. And if we can get together a really good grid that, you know, inputs all that energy and takes it out when we need it, we'll be getting there. And yeah, I really liked what the speaker from Nigeria said about, you know, putting blood, sweat and tears into it. We've got to, whether it's fighting for reforms that eventually get us somewhere more exciting, we need to put our backs to the grindstone. Thank you.